From the City of Angels off the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Noory, and welcome to Coast AM. Up next, our special guest tonight, John Lott, as we talk about freedomnomics and also more guns, less crime. John Lott is a senior research scientist at the University of Maryland and was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission during 1988 to 1989. John received his Ph.D. in economics from UCLA in 1984. He has published more than 100 articles in academic journals. Quite an accomplished author as well. We'll talk about his works. Here he is, John Lott, on Coast to Coast. John, welcome back.
Oh, great to be talking to you again.
Likewise. John, it seems like everything you touch is controversial, the areas that you probe and study. How did you get involved originally writing a book and doing research on guns, less crime?
Well, it was definitely by accident. I had done a lot of work on crime. I'd been chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission. I taught a lot of classes on crime. I'd written a lot of articles on crime, but they had never had anything to do with guns. They had been with white-collar and corporate crime, reputational penalties that criminals face. A lot of those issues are, in fact, talked about in the book that we talked about last hour, the Freedomnomics book. But what had happened in 1993, I was teaching a class on white-collar and corporate crime at the Wharton Business School, and some students came up to me after class, and they wondered if I could spend part of a lecture just talking about gun control. And I said, well, I guess we have a little bit extra time. We could probably do a little bit on that. And I'd read some of the academic research on gun control and found it pretty wanting, but I figured, well, maybe there's other stuff that's good out there, and if you're going to teach on something for a little bit, it kind of forces you to look through the literature. And I was just pretty shocked by how poorly done the existing research was. You'd have some of the larger studies would be looking at like 32 counties from across the United States. I don't know how you pick 32 counties. I mean, there's 3,140 counties, and it just seems very arbitrary to pick 32. And you would and I could go through for a couple hours and just talk about the problems with the work. But one of the reasons why you do research is either you have a new idea that nobody's had before, or you think you can do a better job. And I usually try to do things that have kind of a twist or looking at a problem that nobody's thought of before. And so the gun stuff wasn't quite as interesting to me because it was something that wasn't new, but I thought I could do a better job. And that's one thing led to another on that. And in 96, after I'd done my initial research on that, a reporter from USA Today named Dennis Cushon, who I had gotten to know when I was chief economist at the Sentencing Commission, he'd call me up every couple of years when he had some question about crime. And he called me up and he asked me some questions at the end. He said, well, what are you working on? And so I mentioned it to him. He said, well, send me a copy of the paper. I'll look at it. And I sent it to him. And a couple of weeks later, he called me up, said it was really interesting, and that he'd probably get around to writing a story on it. Lo and behold, the next morning there was a story out, and just the interest and the work just exploded after that. It was really quite an amazing.
John, I'm a supporter in guns, as you know, and the Second Amendment, and this is a subject, of course, with most people. You either support guns or you don't. There's really no middle ground here at all. Very controversial. Those who do not support guns hate them. Those who like guns and support the use of guns for law-abiding citizens, of course, we know where they stand. How do you answer the criticism, because this is a tough one, when some kid or a wacko goes ballistic, either with an assault weapon or handguns, going into a school or a mall or somewhere, college, and he kills 10, 15, 20 people?
Right.
What do we say about that? First of all, have all those people legally owned guns? Have they stolen them from their parents? What are the situations with those cases?
Well, you have a whole range of issues on where they ended up getting the guns to begin with. But I start, before I go into kind of the weeds on those things, which are interesting questions, and just usually if I have a chance to talk to an audience, the first thing I'll do is just say, where do you get your information about guns? And the media has a huge impact on people.
Yes.
Usually what I'll say to people is, without thinking about it very hard, you can recall what seems like hundreds or thousands of stories about bad things that happen with guns. When was the last time you watched the national evening news and heard a story about somebody using a gun to protect themselves, protect somebody else? And usually people can't, and legitimately so, can't recall a story or maybe one possible story that they can recall. And people, I think...
And it's not that it's not happening.
No, exactly right. No, that's exactly right. And, people have a pretty good idea of the bad things that happen with guns. But, each year we have about 450,000 crimes that are committed with guns, according to surveys by the Department of Justice. They have to do surveys because not everybody reports a crime to the police. But those same types of surveys indicate that people use guns defensively about 2 million times a year. That means they use guns about 4 to 5 times more frequently each year to stop crime than they use them to commit crime. Now, one of the reasons why I don't think a lot of this gets news coverage is that the vast majority, 95% or so of the times that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to go and cause the criminal to run away. And if you're a news reporter or an editor and you have 2 stories, in one case there's a dead body on the ground, sympathetic person like a victim, versus another story where you have a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be attackers run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, no crime actually committed, you're not even sure what crime would have been committed, I think any of us would choose the first story as being more newsworthy than the second. And that explains a huge percentage of the lack of coverage for those types of cases. But, the type of situation that you're bringing up at the beginning of your question, in fact, shows that that type of benign explanation can't explain everything with regard to media coverage. Relatively few people know that about a quarter of the public school shootings in the United States have been stopped by citizens with guns before uniformed police were able to arrive. And the reason why they're unlikely to know that is only about 1% of the news stories on those attacks are mentioned when a citizen used a gun to stop the attack, that's what happened. If a police officer stops an attack, about 36% of those news stories will mention that the police officer used his gun to stop the attack. You look at cases like the first of the public school shootings in Pearl, Mississippi in October 1997, in which 2 people were killed. You had an assistant principal there at the school, a former Marine, someone who had a permit to carry a concealed handgun, a guy named Joel Myrick. He would regularly carry his permanent concealed handgun with him on school property up until the end of 1995 when the Federal Safe School Zone Act was passed.
Okay.
After that, being a law-abiding citizen, he would lock his gun in his car, park it more than a quarter mile off school property in order to obey the 1,000-foot rule. When the attack started that day, he had to run a half mile to get his gun, a half mile back, and yet he was still able to hold the attacker at point-blank range for 5.5 minutes before the police were able to arrive. If you do what's called a nexus search, which is a computerized news search of news stories, you'll find in the 1 month after that attack, 687 separate news stories about the incident. Only 19 mentioned the assistant principal in any way. Only 13 of the 19 mentioned that the assistant principal was involved in some way with stopping the attack. And only 10 of the news stories mentioned that he actually used his gun to stop the attack. 8 of those were in local newspapers near where the attack had occurred. 2 of them were on national broadcast. One was on ABC World News Now, had a sentence on it at the 4 a.m. news broadcast. And then CNN had a story on it the day later on Early Prime, had about a sentence on it. But you see that time after time in terms of these cases. There was one case after the Appalachian Law School shooting about 6 years ago now, in which 3 people were killed, where I happened to be on a radio show, Larry Elder. I used to have a national show, and one of the 2 students who had used their guns to stop the attack was on it, and he was telling Larry that he must have been interviewed by over 50 reporters after the attack had occurred, and being a law student, he used these computerized news searches just to see how he was quoted and what types of articles they wrote about him helping stop the attack, and he just couldn't find news stories mentioning it.
Jeez.
And I thought, the kid's probably exaggerating a little bit, so I decided when I was writing my book, The Bias Against Guns, to go and call up the reporters and find out, one, did they know